I'm Dr. Jay Peacock, Professor of History at Nash Community College, and this is History 132, American History 2.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there.
Although the Vietnam War was part of the larger Cold War, it played such a dominant role in American life in the late 1960s and early 1970s that it deserves special attention. The roots of America's involvement in Southeast Asia went back to at least the late 1940s and involved the presidential administrations of Harry S. Truman, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and John F. Kennedy. But it was under Lyndon B. Johnson in the mid-1960s that the United States became heavily involved in the ground war in Vietnam. As the U.S. increasingly took over the burden of the war effort from the South Vietnamese and their struggle with communism, American casualties began to mount. As they did so, opposition to the war also began to increase. By the time the United States finally withdrew its ground combat troops in 1973, the U.S. had lost almost 60,000 dead in Vietnam, and the country was divided more than it had been since the Civil War 100 years earlier. There are many differing opinions about why the greatest power in the world was unable to achieve victory in Vietnam. For the most part, the U.S. never had a very realistic strategy for winning an unconventional war. The Pentagon tended to fixate on the so-called search and destroy mission and the body count of enemy dead. Although the U.S. bombed communist targets in North Vietnam heavily, American troops never invaded the North for fear of provoking either Communist China or the Soviet Union into the war. Vietnam was also the first American conflict in the television age. Some argue that the media intentionally distorted the war news from Vietnam in order to turn public opinion against it. That is a debatable point, but certainly Americans did not like the reports they were getting on the nightly news. This was especially true beginning with the so-called Tet Offensive in early 1968, which many regard as the major turning point in the war. The Vietnam War coincided with other turbulent events of the 60s, including the Civil Rights Movement and increasing youth rebellion. Many who had been active in the Civil Rights Revolution of the late 1950s and early 1960s also became heavily involved in the anti-war movement of the late 60s and early 70s. Much of the opposition to the war came from young people, partly because they were most likely to be drafted and sent to fight in Vietnam, but also because the generation that came of age in the 60s was already involved in other forms of student protest. The mounting casualties and increasingly violent opposition to the war drove Lyndon Johnson from office in 1968, just 4 years after he had won one of the biggest landslide victories in American presidential history. LBJ's successor, Richard M. Nixon, gradually withdrew American ground combat troops from Vietnam, but in other ways, Nixon expanded the war by sending American troops into neighboring Cambodia. Nixon eventually negotiated an end to the war in early 1973, but just 2 years later, communist troops occupied Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, and unified the country under a communist government. By any reasonable definition, the Vietnam War was a defeat for the United States. In the larger context of the Cold War, however, it was just one lost battle in an ultimately victorious showdown with communism. But many of the scars and divisions that plagued the country in the 1960s and 1970s were either caused or reflected by the war in far-flung Southeast Asia.